Right, we're nearly there, and here we go. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to What's Cooking in Carbon. As you can see with the title, this webinar is about the latest and greatest in climate action. Now, since carbon can be quite a fast evolving space, we plan to do one of these every few months. So I just wanted to add a note up front saying, if you'd like to, I'd recommend you sign up to our mailing list so you get notified each time we look to organize one of these. Now, the idea behind these webinars is that luckily we have a team of experts here at Towitu and Warake that are committed to staying across these movements in climate action. So we want to have these webinars to help New Zealand businesses stay across these movements and stay ahead of the curve. Now, speaking of expertise, we have a fantastic panel of speakers here for you today. From Towitu and Warake, our presentation is going to be led by Danny Rood. He's recently joined our technical team as a technical advisor, and he will be supported through the Q&A box and the Q&A section in the end by senior leaders of our technical team, Belinda and Stu. So we've got some fantastic expertise all around. Spoiler alert, a key theme of this webinar is COP26. And we're really excited to have our guest speaker here today, Rod Oram, who was actually able to attend the conference in Glasgow. So we're really excited to have you here, Rod. For the two of you that don't know Rod Oram, he is a leading voice. He's a business journalist and a leading voice in business, economics, sustainability, and climate action. And so he can bring some really valuable insights from his experiences on ground and what he learned at the conference. Now, just a quick detour for the two housekeeping notes that I have. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded. So if you do drop off for any reason, the recording and the slides will be shared with you afterwards. And remember to pop throughout the presentation, remember to pop your questions in through the Q&A panel and not the chat panel. This allows us to then make sure that we answer all of the questions. And we've also enabled the upvote feature. And that way, the most popular questions get answered up front. All right, without further ado, I will hand over to Danny.
Cool, kia ora, koutou katoa, ko Danny Rood tōku ingoa. Ko Towitu and Warake aho e mahi ana. Thank you for that introduction, Ashish. And thank you for all for giving up your time and attention today. We are mindful that it's been a long year. There's been a bit going on. That Zoom has been a part of your lives for a while now. So I just urge yourself to make yourself comfortable and be in a position that you feel that you're ready to listen and maybe learn a couple of things. So yeah, this is the first in the series of What's Cooking in Carbon, with a focus on COP26, where we will go through a summary of the COP and where to next. So the outline of today, we will look at a recap of pre-COP affairs, the significance of COP. Was it a good COP or a bad COP? A recap of the key events there and decisions and agreements from the event. And that's where we all have our special guest Rod Oram joining us for a bit of back and forth and to hear his insights. We'll also discuss what this means for Aotearoa New Zealand, and we will go through your questions at the end, and we'll do our best to answer those, and we look forward to those coming in. So to set the scene, internationally, there was a bit going on. So earlier in February, the UN report on nationally determined contributions, which is basically a country's climate target or pledge. That report outlined that all of those NDCs fall far short of what is required, and that the current NDCs combined would have led to a rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius. So not quite where we want to be in terms of 1.5 or well below 2. The estimated reductions on greenhouse gas emissions fall far short of what is required, demonstrating the need for parties to further strengthen their mitigation commitments under the Paris Agreement.
Sorry, Danny, I just want to make sure you're sharing your screen.
Yes, hold on. Sorry about that. Let's see. Share. All right, are we back in business?
Yes, we are.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that, everyone. You didn't miss too much. It was just the outline slide. And now we're into pre-COP affairs. So as well as that, we also had the IPCC 6 assessment report was released in August. So that was a look at the physical science. And what it outlined there was that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. As well as that, the projected changes and extremes are larger in frequency and intensity with every additional increment of global warming. Combine that with the idea that they've outlined that every ton of carbon dioxide emissions adds to global warming. So some pretty stern findings there from that report. In September, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that time is running out, irreversible climate tipping points lie alarmingly close. He called for more ambition, saying that all leaders must recognise that we are in the middle of a climate emergency. Closer to home, or our own home, Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's a few policies and happenings going on. We had the Climate Commission report released in May, which provided independent advice on New Zealand's emissions budgets. The report outlined that we are not on track to meet our climate targets and we must move faster. There were some government announcements to address and tackle climate change made this year, including the Clean Car Discount, which aims to reduce carbon dioxide emissions of light vehicles by making low emission options more affordable. We also had the Carbon Neutral Government Program kicking into gear with a program aimed to make a number of organisations within the public sector carbon neutral from 2025. That would include removing coal-fired boilers from the public service, electrifying the car fleet, and that kind of gear. We also had the climate-related financial disclosures pass its third reading last month in Parliament, so that is now law. With that piece of legislation will make climate-related disclosures mandatory for some organisations. The requirement would apply to publicly listed companies and large insurers, banks, and investment managers. We also updated our NDC. So just before COP26, we're looking at we have now committed to a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. This compares to the previous NDC, which was to have emissions 30% below 2005 levels. It is important to note that was a gross target and the current one is a net target. So in real terms, this is a 41% reduction by 2030. That is what we're committing to. And a lot of reduction could come from purchasing offshore climate offsets. With respect to budgets, Aotearoa New Zealand is using a system of emissions budgets to meet our 2050 target. An emissions budget is a total quantity of emissions that can be released during a certain period. Each emissions budget covers a period of 5 years, except the first emissions budget, which will cover the period 2022 to 2025. These budgets act as stepping stones to reach 2050 emissions reductions targets. And a little reminder what those targets are: net zero greenhouse gas emissions except for biogenic methane, and a 24 to 47% reduction in biogenic methane by 2050. So when it comes to climate conventions, the last one was cancelled for some reason. I think there was something going on that stopped everyone doing things for about a year. So there was no convention in 2020. So COP26 was, there was a lot of focus on this one. So what's the point of these conventions? Well, they enable countries to agree on targets, goals, and actions to tackle the climate crisis. They're referred to as a conference of parties. So that's where the term COP comes from. Parties is more a UN approach to, parties is a UN term for countries. Like UN do like to come up with their own language for certain things, and that's the one we had there. So these COPs, they're attended by, represent delegates from each country to do the negotiations and put their cases forward and announce new pledges. They're also attended by media, NGOs, businesses, and the general public. And the ultimate goal here is to be limiting warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. And it is just a reminder that we've actually already gone past 1 degree of warming. So the significance of this COP, well, you compare it to other ones where, sometimes conventions don't actually produce meaningful results. So for example, the 2009 COP15 in Copenhagen saw a Copenhagen Accord drafted, but it was only done by a select group of countries. Then it wasn't actually adopted. Instead, the accord was taken note of. So you compare this to 2015, the COP21 in Paris, where the Paris Agreement was born, and they produced a legally binding commitment to reduce emissions. So for the first time ever, every country agreed to work together to limit global warming to below 2 degrees. And so that's significant. If you compare to where we were in 2009, we only had a handful of countries trying to do something, and they didn't even do it. They just like, oh, we'll just make a note of that. And you've got all countries now saying, hey, this is where we need to be going. That's a big change. And it's easy to sort of be absorbed by the doom and gloom concerning the climate crisis. So it's good to have some perspective to see that we've moved a lot since 2009. So this year's COP took place in Glasgow in Scotland from the end of October through to nearly mid-November. It involves significant collaboration between the parties, and it gives them a chance to finalize the Paris rulebook. So, but why is it so important? Like, people are like, well, why this COP? What is the significance of this one? And I think a big part of that is that there is a notable increase in the dramatic and severe impacts on climate. On the planet and nature if we reach 2 degrees of warming compared to 1.5 degrees. So this includes a third of the world's population being regularly exposed to severe heat, which can lead to health problems and heat-related deaths. Almost all coral reefs would be destroyed, and the Arctic ice would melt entirely at least one summer each decade. So that's going to have devastating impacts on the wildlife and communities they support. There is also the possibility of irreversible loss of ice sheets in Greenland and the Antarctic. This has potential to lead to several meters of sea level rise. So we can't avoid 30 centimeters of sea level rise by 2060, and we can't avoid 50 centimeters by 2100. That does provide some adaptation opportunities, but it is important to know that some of that sea level rise is already locked in. So, but at 1.5 degrees compared to those 2 degree scenarios I just talked about, impacts would still be serious but less severe. There could be fewer food and water shortages and fewer species at risk of extinction. Threats to human health would also be lower from pollution, disease, and malnutrition. So 0.5 degree of warming, it may not sound like much, but the difference is much more than just a number. We had US climate envoy John Kerry pull out the line, this is the last best hope for the world to get its act together. It did give the world's media the chance to use the phrase last chance saloon ad nauseum, and that's where it came from. Not sure about you, but I do think John Kerry is starting to look a lot more like Leonard Cohen as he gets older. So what were the objectives of COP? It's not like they turn up and like, oh, how should we do it? Now we're here, what do you want to talk about? It's more, there's bigger overarching principles in mind there. So you're looking at securing global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach, which Boris Johnson sort of picked up and ran with in terms of keeping 1.5 alive. A bit of rhyming never hurts in terms of marketing. So countries were asked to present ambitious 2030 reduction targets that aligned with reaching that net zero by 2050. And that countries would need to take significant action on items such as accelerating the phase out of coal, curtailing deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles, and rapidly scaling up investment in renewable energy sources. Another objective of COP was to adapt to protecting communities and natural habitats. So the climate's already changing, and it will continue to change even as we reduce emissions. I've already talked about some of that sea level rise that's locked in. So COP26 would enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to protect and restore their ecosystems and build defenses, warning systems, and more resilient infrastructure. There's also the aspect of mobilizing finance. So if you want to achieve those first two goals, the countries must make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance per year. by 2020. So that was set at I think that was set at 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen. And the numbers coming in that we're about $20 billion short a year. It's trending in the right direction, which is positive, but it is short of what was discussed. And of course, the age-old adage of UN approach to thing was to work together to deliver. So it might leave you wondering, you've probably seen a couple of stories here and there, or you may have followed it more intensely. You might be wondering, how did it go? And this is where we have the opportunity to talk to Rod Oram, who was able to go for the first time. And we will run through a few questions with him. Kia ora, Rod.
Kia ora, Danny. Great to see you.
You too as well. So you would have been hotly anticipating getting over there. There's a lot of action, a lot of countries heading there, delegates. So the first big question is, when did you start your Movember effort?
Well, actually, the Northern Hemisphere summer of 1972, to be precise. So mine is a moustache for life. None of this none of this worthy charitable stuff of just for November.
And mine's 23 days old, so not bad.
So I'm 23 years, well, more like 40 years old at this point.
Good little effort. So how'd you find it?
Well, it was completely extraordinary because this literally was a hui of humanity. 194 countries, a few weren't able to send any delegates, Papua New Guinea being one, and some of our small Pacific Island neighbors, but 194 countries and 40,000 people, a combination of government delegates, both politicians and civil servants, and civil society delegates in NGOs and businesses and institutions and the like, and about 3,700 journalists as well. So quite a crowd in one place, and so truly a global village. And I'd have to say that I felt hugely empowered, enlightened and energized by everything I saw there, because the sort of person who comes to COP has a steely-eyed view of what needs to be done very fast, but undaunted, is constantly creative, seeking to get the message across, finding people to work with. And that was a very special combination, which made it an amazing couple of weeks.
There you go. So are they long days? Like, is it something you start at 9 and finish at 5, or is it something like crack of dawn and you're staying up all through the night?
Well, I needed to get up about 6:30 in the morning, sometimes to do live Zoom panel sessions back to New Zealand in New Zealand time, and have breakfast and do my daily lateral flow test of COVID for COVID, so I could show a negative result when I got to the security perimeter of COP. And by the time I'd walked about 20 minutes from my accommodation to that security perimeter, good time to ruminate and think about the day, then a bit of a delay getting through all that security, especially in rush hour in the morning. And then my days would last until as long as about, I think my latest was 10:30 one evening, before I had that lovely walk back to my accommodation. So they were long days, but immensely rewarding, and I managed to pace myself well. So I was still managed to function by the last day.
Yeah, that pacing approach is pretty important. So in terms of the New Zealand delegation, like what kind of split was it? And obviously like the official delegation being government representatives, but also there were some New Zealand businesses there. And a couple of NGOs, and like, how does that compare to like the overall split? So like you talked about the over 3,000 media. How did the what people from New Zealand who went, how does that sort of fit into the overall representation?
The New Zealand official delegation was very small because of pandemic constraints, although of course the government late in the day did make spaces available in MIQ for people who were going to go, but I'm afraid too many people had already been deterred. So there were a very small New Zealand delegation, both politicians, one politician, James Shaw, Climate Minister, and civil servants from various government agencies, led by Kay Harrison, our climate ambassador and chief negotiator. And then also on the New Zealand delegation, there were civil society members, so representing iwi and Pacifica, for example. But there was not, for example, a specific youth delegate this time, nor sadly did the national parties climate spokesman choose to go, because there is a long tradition of bipartisanship in making a place available for the opposition spokesperson. So small delegation, and then very small business representation. I was only aware of a handful of people from New Zealand business who were there in person. Others were contributing online to some of the virtual presentations, which was good. So for example, Kanga Ora had a wonderful presentation that was in a virtual pavilion on urban form with one of their projects, which was very exciting to see.
What made that project so exciting?
Because it's very much focused on how we build very differently to meet climate objectives. So it's not just about energy efficient homes, but it's about the materials we use, and to some extent exploring how we change urban form in terms of how we group activities in a community, so to minimize travel and the rest. So a very good project, which is informing a lot of their work now. And in terms of media, there was just two of us, I believe, myself and Olivia Wannon from Stuff there from New Zealand. TVNZ and TV3 had their European-based reporters there. And I think we were pretty much the only New Zealand media. And overall, New Zealand's presence was very limited. Whilst we played a useful role, and I'll come to that point later, in negotiations, and I'm sure we were doing some things behind the scenes, we were making virtually nothing of a public statement or presence there, which we've done in past COPs.
Okay, so in the lead up to COP, for you, what would have a home run have looked like for COP?
I was always realistic that although we were all seriously cheering for and urging commitments from countries that would put us on a 1.5 degree pathway, that was a very, very, very big ask. So I was always looking for a much more rounded view of what all was achieved there, because an amazing amount of stuff happens at COP. And I think that on balance, and I'll share a couple of slides in a moment, on balance, it was a very good COP, but obviously fundamentally important to keep absolutely front of mind that we're still very far adrift of that utterly first order issue of a very fast and deep cuts in emissions, because if we don't have those, we can't do the rest. And although there's lots of other good stuff happening, in aggregate, that doesn't add up to save, to helping us solve the climate crisis. Fundamentally, we have to have very deep and very rapid emission reductions. And that's why that sense of urgency is why methane over this past year has shot to absolute top of the emissions issues. And I'll come back to that point about the global methane pledge, which New Zealand and more than 100 other countries signed.
Yeah, so you would say it was a good COP opposed to a bad COP?
Yes, I would, but only with that terribly important caveat that we didn't solve that very big problem of getting fast enough, deep enough emissions cuts. However, there were a number of things that were agreed, which hopefully will speed up that process. But time is so eye-wateringly short at this point that we have to keep this sort of absolutely intense focus on emissions reductions.
Okay, would you like to talk to some of those?
I will just quickly
factors.
flip through those two sides I said.
Okay,
yeah.
Let's try and get this going. Bear with me, everyone. Sorry. Let's get those slides.
Yeah, that's the first one there. So here we have the failure, and that was the failure to achieve a 1.5 degree pathway, because the additional pledges from countries were not enough. Now, to set this in context, I think a very helpful way of thinking about this is not just by temperature, Absolutely keep our eye on that, but understand what that translates to in terms of fast and deep emission cuts. So this is a very helpful chart from the BBC showing what the pledges before COP amounted to in terms of projected greenhouse gas emissions in 2030, and where those increased pledges got to by the end of COP, and still this very big shortfall. And just to keep that in perspective, my second point on the slide is that we know what the total budget is for humanity for greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2050 if we want to hit 1.5 degrees. And it is only 440 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. And that's just 9 years of emissions at current rates. But we've got to get to 2050 with that budget. So that's why the fast, deep cuts are so important. And then a subsidiary issue is about nowhere near enough was achieved on finance for developing countries, particularly on their very crucial issues with loss and damage, because they're already suffering more than developed countries in terms of environmental impacts, climate impacts. And whilst last point, there was a lot going on with a shift towards nature-based solutions of various kinds, and far more sophisticated than just sequestering carbon in trees. And some key elements were being put in place there. That was not anywhere near enough. But let me now move on to my second and last slide, which is about the successes. It was very clear from the nature of all the conversations and debate that there is unanimous agreement on the destination, and that's now 1.5 degrees. You heard nobody trying to deny that or suggest something different. But again, a negative there, there's nowhere near enough speed of travel towards that. Then indeed, the next thing, which does help speed things up, nations are now urged to increase their climate pledges, their nationally determined contributions, every year, not every 5 years as currently, and to base those on 5-year budgets, not 10 years in the Paris Agreement, and also to demonstrate policies and outcomes that are showing progress. So it's not just about saying, oh, well, here's the plan, but showing you doing something. Then the global methane pledge is really important because it's calling for 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. And proposed by the US and the EU, and as I said, signed by more than 100 countries, including New Zealand. It's not binding. Countries don't have to reach that 30% cut. That's far deeper than we are hoping to achieve. And I would say, I believe we can do far better than we're aiming for. We can cut far more than we're aiming for.
So how come we signed up to it if it's you think it requires more than what we've committed to under our NDC?
Because the 30% by 2030 was not a binding target. The requirement for signing up was that you are committed to reducing methane and helping in that global effort to do so. So in that sense, it's a low bar. And so often with all the pacts, alliances and agreements at COP, there are substantial weak points in them or lack of discipline in them. So you always have to take them with a pinch of salt, but still they do have value in terms of focusing people's mind. On finance, private sector finance was completely extraordinary. So the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, pulled together by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, and now co-chair of the UN's private sector finance drive. His co-chair is Michael Bloomberg, and got pledges from institutional investors around the world who control 130 trillion US dollars of assets, that they all said that we want to focus on climate solutions. But again, a low bar there, because originally to join up to GFANZ, you had to pledge not to invest any more money in fossil fuels. And that was dropped in the later stages. So again, a low bar, but still encouraging. The next thing is the Paris Agreement rulebook. This has taken 6 years since Paris to agree. Two key elements of it. One is rules on international carbon markets, and although there are still some weaknesses in those rules, they have finally managed to banish some of the more egregious loopholes which were there, and substantially reduced the risk of double counting in various ways. So somebody trying to count emissions reductions twice, or two parties trying to count the same reduction. And then also on transparency, which is the really important point from Paris, that every country has to report and do so in a uniform way, so the UN can aggregate up all of those emissions and track the progress on them. Now, that work stream has been led globally by our Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Helen Plume, senior MFAT person, has led that work globally. And then our Climate Minister, James Shaw, was co-chair with his opposite number from Antigua and Barbuda, a small Caribbean country, to get that through the negotiation process, and that got landed. So they landed transparency, and others landed carbon markets. Then a success in part is that we have this phase down in coal-fired electricity, unspecified date, and the word down rather than out. But still, it is a line in the sand, and an end to inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Obviously, any of them is inefficient, but it's not quite defined that rigorously. And crucially, this is the first time since the Kyoto Protocol, so that's over 25 years, that fossil fuels have been directly related to the climate crisis. So that language is important. And then lastly, there was a whole bunch of alliances, pledges, etc., on ending deforestation by 2030, improving land use change, and improving agricultural practices. But I'll highlight the ending deforestation one by 2030. There was a lot of cynicism that Brazil signed up for it and managed to delay the news that in this most recent year, it has deforested faster than it has in the previous 15 years. And that news didn't come out till after COP. But I still think it's really important that Brazil did sign it, because that certainly strengthens the arm of people in Brazil fighting against deforestation. But it also is a way for the global community to hold Brazil to that. And so I'm not cynical about that. I realize it's only aspirational, and it's going to be very difficult to do, but it's still a positive. So I'll leave. I think there are other successes, but I'm sure they will emerge as we have our discussion, and then hopefully some fabulous questions, I'm sure, from our people joining us online. So thank you for the chance to give you that bit of an overview.
No, thank you. Let's go back to this. So I was wondering, like, when you talked about how it was a phase down of coal, but initially it was a phase out, was that something like the big countries that play there, some of the BRIC nations perhaps, so like the Brazil, Russia, India, China deciding to throw their weight around, or was there something else going on?
It was a very last minute change, literally in the last couple of hours, and caused huddles on the plenary floor that everybody could see. Yes, that was led by India and China. And that caused, I think, a lot of unfair criticism of India, because the really important thing about India was they kicked off COP with three very ambitious goals that they pledged to. The first was to be net zero by 2017. You go, well, heavens, 2070, that's a long way away. It's not 2050. But they're the second most populous country in the world and the third largest economy. And in the next few years, they will overtake the US as the world's second largest economy. So then their second pledge, so they've got lots of growth, lots of development to do. So 2070 is more realistic. But their second pledge was to reduce the carbon intensity of their economy, i.e. emissions per unit of GDP, by something, I think, by about a third. I'm sorry, that number is not right at the front of my mind, but a very significant measure. But here's the really important one. They pledged to make 50% of their electricity generation by renewables by 2030. And they are prodigious burners of coal for electricity. And they were making a very big plea to the international community to help them reach that goal. So in pushing for phase down, they were saying, look, phase out still remains beyond our capability, and we need a great deal of help. So they were laying down a marker that they can't do this on their own. So I think that that criticism of India at the end was really unfair. I think that they had kicked off COP with 3 very substantial commitments.
Where do you think that criticism stems from? I mean, and then that sort of can be linked to some cynicism where some people or delegates would be like, look, is there any danger, India, of actually going a bit faster? Like,
there is. I am a very firm believer that we all, whether we be individuals or companies, here in New Zealand or around the world, or governments large or small, we have to commit to really big goals that we have no idea how we're going to achieve, because it seems completely beyond our current technology, our economic capacity, whatever. But it's only when we make those commitments very publicly and hopefully bindingly that focuses our minds, that really gets us working together far more intensively. It really ramps up investment and technology improvement. So I do believe that. Having said that, though, I think there's a real danger that if we don't make good judgments about all this, we are causing a great deal of damage. And to me, one of the most fascinating things about COP, the talking points about how COP was going and what its failures were from very hard out environmental activists and respectable organizations were identical in many of their key points to the talking points from climate delayers is the term now, because nobody around is denying this or saying so publicly. So the strategy is now climate delayers. And so fascinating that their 2 talking points or lists of talking points were essentially the same, even though they have completely different goals. And the result of that, though, or the impact of that, though, is to substantially worry and demotivate people. We need to be worried, but we need to remain motivated. So that's why I think you have to think hard and deep about what's going on here and absolutely refrain from superficial judgments.
That's a fair point. Just one more question before we go into the what this means for Aotearoa section. So what do you think this really means for countries and how they approach the climate crisis? Will some just keep emitting what they're already doing, like keep their emissions up here and then just try and offset the rest? Is that like an okay approach, or?
I don't think you'll obviously going to feel some people are around who still think that way. But increasingly, it's fewer and fewer sort of organizations. I mean, even sort of fossil fuel oil companies are beginning to gradually recognize that. So I think there is real progress here. And I would liken it to trying to push a very heavy vehicle to try and start it. And it's incredibly hard to get any kind of momentum going. But I feel that, or turn that flywheel for the first time around. But once you've turned it once, it starts to go a bit faster. And that's what's going on now. And there's a very clear line coming through that this COP was finalizing the goals by and large, although we need to keep upping those goals. But what the real work now is actual delivery, and that the next COP, which will be in the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, a fancy resort in Egypt, roughly this time next year, it's all about delivery. And I think that we all have to be now intensely focused. We know what the challenge is, by and large, and we just have to now achieve this unprecedented scale of change and complexity of change, that humankind has never come within before. So that we've got a little bit of work to do.
Yeah, it's no small task. There's a bit going on. So thanks for that. Okay, I'm just going to share screen again and jump into the last little part of the presentation before answering your questions. So 2022 and beyond, what it might mean for Aotearoa. Well, in a national context, we do have the emissions reduction plan that will be released in May, and that sort of comes out at the same time, similar time as the budget. And those emissions reduction plan submissions are due tonight at 11:59. We also have COP27, as Rod just talked about, that taking place in Egypt in November. What this might mean for the business sector, we'll probably be seeing a lot more leadership and collaboration from what already exists, but it's also a question of what that collaboration looks like and who is it between. Are we talking about government agencies with universities? Is it universities and CRIs? Is it business with government? Is it universities with businesses? So there's a few things to consider there. We might be seeing more specific sector initiatives, more ambitious projects, and more projects that and initiatives that have been announced in the past that would have been completed and ready for implementation. So those are just some of the things we might be seeing. Rod, do you have any comment on those, what you might expect to see?
The one thing that I want to emphasize more than anything else, and I think it's a very big theme that was always at the front of my mind, but is now completely crystallized by COP26. It's that governments are lagging on this. It's still very hard for them to come up with policies, feel there's enough support for them, and all that kind of ways in which they're hobbled. And it's deemed that business is leading, and that's true. There were very big sectoral commitments from very big, hard to abate emitters, such as steel and concrete and cement and aviation fuels, for example. So that's all good, but that would suggest that if it was all about technology and business, that would suggest that the climate crisis is actually simply a business failure or a technology failure or an energy failure, wrong energy source for where we are in the world now and time and place. But it's more than that. The climate crisis is part of two co-crises, the other one being the damage that we're doing to the biosphere, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse. And the cause of the climate crisis is also the cause of that biodiversity crisis. But that's about consumption patterns and all sorts of other deep sustainability issues that go beyond just the climate one. So this is a whole of society crisis, not a technology or energy crisis. And therefore the response has to be a whole of society response, which is why my urgent plea to business is that business understands that and works harder to help build that whole of society response. Because it's only then that politicians will deliver what we need in terms of policies and programs and regulation and all the rest, that business needs to do its job. So that's the virtuous cycle there. And so in a small country like ours, I think we're far better placed than many other countries. And New Zealand businesses, I think, are more in touch with the whole of society than you would find in many other countries. So I think this is a natural thing for us to do. But my urgent plea to businesses, regardless of what size you are, is to think about not just narrowly what you're trying to do in your business or in your sector, but trying to understand what the whole of society context is for that and how you can help move that along too.
Wonderful. Thank you for all your facts about the pacts and presenting what you experienced at such a significant event. I'll pass on to Ashish now, who will take us through the Q&A session.
All right, awesome stuff, team. Look, a couple of really, really interesting questions in the Q&A box. I'll start off with the one posted by Kath Dewar. Kia ora, Kath. So she'd like to hear from Rod on methane and New Zealand agriculture and what that means both for laggards in our food sector and for regenerative agriculture leaders. She'd also like to know your views on impacts for our exporters, especially in the context of the UK-New Zealand free trade. Sorry, I lost the question. Free trade deal and UK farming pushback, critiquing New Zealand's agricultural record, example, the Red Tractor campaign.
Yeah, thanks, Kath, and thanks for your message just before we started. I look forward to catching up with you. It's lovely to be back. Almost. I've got 3 more days before I'm re-released to the wild from isolation. On the first point, let me just very briefly recap on the Global Methane Pledge, because it is across all sources of human-induced methane. And the focus initially is on oil and gas, fugitive methane gas from production, but largely from transmission. And it's largely gas rather than oil production and fracking, but they're all part of the picture. Because those are easy things to fix. There's increasingly satellites circling the globe identifying those serious methane leaks. And the technology for fixing them is completely straightforward. So to use a well-worn phrase, very low-hanging fruit. But those sources of methane are only the second largest. The biggest is from agriculture. And it's not just ruminant animals, it's the likes of rice paddies, for example. And so it would be a huge mistake for New Zealand and for New Zealand farmers to believe this is all about the oil and gas sector and it's not about agriculture. 2 of the countries that signed up specifically mentioned agriculture as they signed up for the pledge. Meanwhile, there's an awful lot going on out in agriculture. And I cite this example often because it shows you what ambition looks like. Nestle is the world's largest food producer. Taking a 2020 base, it's working on a 25% reduction in all of its emissions, scope 1 to 3, it's farmers at one end, consumers at the other, by 2025, and 50% by 2030, and being carbon neutral by 2050. Unilever's going even faster, carbon neutral by 2039. To do that, Nestle is working very closely with farmer suppliers around the world. It's investing $1.5 billion in regenerative agriculture with farmers over the next 5 years. I had very good interviews with senior Nestle people in Glasgow, and they told me, for example, about how impressive are the methane cuts with a dairy cooperative in southern Scotland is achieving with existing technologies, not hanging around waiting for vaccines and inhibitors. Now, that's a really important story to tell because Nestle is Fonterra's largest customer. So that brings it right home. And the problem here in New Zealand is that our farmers, many of them, and the institutions that represent them are saying that we're already the lowest methane in terms of kilograms of methane per amount of methane per kilogram of milk solids or meat. So it's up for the rest of the world to catch up with us. So we actually don't need to do much. And anyway, we can't do very much. It's all too hard and too complicated. Both those views are fundamentally wrong because food and agriculture and farming are going off in a different direction and serious emissions reduction. And I'll just give you, to bring this right home to news, is like the report yesterday out from He Wakareka Noa, which is the industry, primary sector, government joint venture trying to work out this kind of stuff, and saying that however we price emissions, it's not going to have much a reduction on reducing emissions. So the example they used was a Canterbury farmer, a dairy farmer, the average would be a payment of almost $17,000 a year if they were in the ETS, but that wouldn't achieve any emissions reductions. But they'd only be paying 5% of that cost. And the government, taxpayers, would be paying the other 95%. I worked this out before we came on air. That's almost $350,000 per average farm in Canterbury dairy farm without any reduction in emissions. The government would be far wiser for that money to buy half a dozen EVs and give them to people. You'd get emissions reductions that way. So that's how completely off beam we are in terms of how ineffectual the work we're doing now versus what on earth is happening in the rest of the world. And that to me is the absolutely fundamental message that I bring home, because agriculture is half our emissions. And if we don't get serious action in the agricultural half, however brilliant we are on the other half, we will completely miss our targets and have to go out and buy even more offsets overseas. This is, I will stop at that point. You asked a second question about trade. The place to watch is the EU, because early next year it'll be bringing out its next development of its work on carbon border adjustment measures, CBAMs. And initially there was a lot of pushback, particularly from the US on this, but the US is beginning to come in line with it. And the EU is doing a very brave thing because CBAMs are obviously necessary to give emitters within a national jurisdiction confidence to invest in what they're doing without fear of being swamped by imports coming in from higher emitting countries. So fundamentally important work. Lastly, on the Red Tractor campaign in the National Farmers Union, that's been going on for years, and they've got nothing new there at the moment. However, they are committed to being a National Farmers Union, committed to being carbon neutral by 2040, and they're developing a very widespread range of programs to make sure all farms in the UK, regardless of their size, location, nature of the farm, great diversity there, like in New Zealand, can respond. So the National Farmers Union in the UK is certainly night and day, obviously being the day, versus the very benighted federated farmers here.
Excellent. Hey, I'd also like to take this opportunity to welcome Stu and Belinda from senior technical leaders on our team. So welcome, team. I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts to add there. Everyone's on mute, by the way.
I think Rod's done a very thorough job of answering the question.
I think he has. Right, I guess.
May I just add, what Toito is doing with farmers is absolutely excellent. It's exactly what has to happen. And it's really important that you're pushing on with those programs with farmers to show how it's done. So, hat tip to you for doing that, because you're showing it can be done, it can be measured, we can make some real progress on this with existing technologies. That's the frustrating thing about all this.
Yeah, and I'll just chip in and say that it's worth being aware that the big companies like Nestle and Danone will typically have a science-based target. Yeah. Which means that they are charting reduction pathways in line with what's defined as science-based for their sector. And an element of that is pushing that down their supply chain. So as Rod mentioned, suppliers such as Fonterra coming into some of these other corporates will be seeing those signals in terms of supply chain engagement.
Yeah, and actually, if I may just pick up on that point, because it's a fundamentally important one to emphasize to everybody setting themselves emissions reduction targets. There is 3 utterly core principles. The first one is it has to be 1.5 degrees as the end goal. It has to be science-based targets, and preferably verified by the Science-Based Target Initiative. And thirdly, it has to be scope 1 to 3. No more of this, well, we'll start on our stuff and build in consumers later. If you're going to get your head around all this stuff, get the head around your whole value chain, your whole supply chain. It's got to be scope 1 to 3. And I suppose I'd add a fourth one, which you've got to set yourself, a point I made earlier, really big targets that you genuinely don't know how you're going to reach them, but you're publicly committing to them, because you'll get kudos for trying the very best you can. And even if you fall a little short, you'll find people far more supportive and understanding than if you set a modest target you breeze through.
Absolutely. And really it will require the whole value chain to be working together on these things. So the more you're engaging with your supply chains or your value chains, the better results you'll get, because you're really all about trying to get the same outcomes, and you can help each other.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, quite a few questions to work through here. So I'm just going to add a quick FYI before we jump to the next one. We will continue to answer questions even if we exceed our time a little bit. But be assured that we are going to record this session. So if you have to log off, you can expect the recording in your mailboxes shortly. So moving on to the next question. It's an anonymous one. It says, Kia ora, Rod, given the more aggressive NDC target from New Zealand, I'm keen to get a sense of whether New Zealand's decision to purchase international units to make up and shortfall could be amended somewhat to be invested domestically. That is, in your opinion, would there be political appetite / will to change this? And could it be done without compromising New Zealand's credibility?
It would enhance New Zealand's credibility if we backed off from our projected large proportion of emissions reductions being met by overseas purchases, for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, we rank with Switzerland as pretty much the only countries that are targeting such a big proportion of emissions reductions coming from overseas purchases. And secondly, it's fundamentally important to invest in your own economy or you get left behind. And Rod Carr was very articulate about this on 9 to Noon last Wednesday. And so we have to be moving fast on emissions reductions. And a further point I'd make is this one, is that we have to save, this is globally consideration, we have to save sequestration capacity to remove existing excess carbon in the atmosphere. We can't compromise that capacity by continuing to put stuff up there and saying, oh, that's fine, sequestration will take care of it. For two reasons. We're compromising that capacity, but more importantly, an actual emissions reduction now has an impact, a better, bigger impact on climate, a beneficial impact on reducing the climate impact versus a delayed response as sequestration gradually takes hold. So that's why it's really, really important that we focus on our own domestic reduction in emissions and make sure we're also doing sequestration much better here. One last point on this is we have to support developing countries. There's no two ways about it. But the better way to do it would be to make technology available or to make finance available for them to reduce their own emissions and to deal with loss and damage and adaptation and all the rest, rather than just saying, oh yeah, well, thanks for doing those emissions. We'll pay you some money for that and just take it on our account. To me, that's a very poor way. I mean, it's some help to those countries, but it's a very inferior way of helping them, a very less effective way of helping them than the alternative I just suggested there.
Excellent. Throwing it to the Toitu team, anything to add there?
Yeah, just to supplement what Rod was saying about, the scarcity of these nature-based solutions and removals available for, neutralising out emissions. The Science-Based Targets Initiative released their net zero framework just before COP26. And one key point there is that when they carve up that remaining global budget in a business sense, the expectation is that the average business should be reducing emissions across their whole value chain by 90% by the year 2050. So when we talk about neutralising residual emissions, it really is residual emissions. It's a small component.
Thanks, Stu. I'm a great fan of that SBTI generally, but that I thought brought an incredibly important clarity and discipline to this.
So another anonymous question is, so I'm also keen to hear a bit more about the signal from Minister Shaw prior to COP26 that New Zealand will again consider offshore offsetting. Why that change in policy when the Climate Change Commission recommended that should be an option of the last resort? We should also miss out on the significant co-benefits of domestic mitigation.
Yeah. Well, no, that doesn't require a question mark at the end of it. That's a perfectly right statement.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, okay, the next question is from Mark Yates. Kia ora, Mark. he says, Kia ora, Rod, fabulous feedback, thanks. What are your views on where the action needs to take place, governments or business? Both is ideal, but business can act faster given the urgency required. Should the media cajole business into faster action? It's a two-part question. Adding to this, education via the media in this carbon reduction space is such a fundamentally important part to help businesses and consumers in acting. Oh, that's just a follow-up comment.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mark, and Kia ora as well, and lovely you're online. I'm just going back to what I was saying earlier, that business can lead very strongly, but is only part of the solution. And business needs to understand how it's helping to achieve that all of society response. And the one particular point I would make to business leaders in New Zealand is that they have a long history of being too reluctant to criticize the National Party, and so what's happening on climate is sorry, let me back up one. When we passed the Zero Carbon Act in 2019, Nationals signed up to it, but identified 7 ways that they would change that framework when they were next in government. That completely undercuts the whole purpose of a framework like that, which is to have consistency of the architecture and thus how we drive on this. And business should be jumping up and down about how completely adrift of understanding and action by the vast majority of political parties is on climate around the world. It's laughable to compare National in opposition with, for example, the Labour Party in opposition in the UK, in terms of the knowledge that they bring to this. So I very urgently implore business to be very public and very direct to the National Party to get them to get on board with this. They're showing an extraordinary lack of knowledge or insight or commitment on all of this.
Absolutely,
Right.
and just a very quick addition. I strongly believe that each of the government and business have a massive part to play, but they've got different parts to play. Government can enable some things that will make it much easier for business, but business need to really put things into place with or without that sort of enabling action to keep things moving really quickly, because yeah, as Mark says, business can move fast.
Yeah.
Nice one. So next question is from Adam Weller. Kia ora, Adam. Did the US put pressure on other countries to not have natural gas in the pledges? That is, leaving a focus on coal, but forcing gas out of the discussions?
Not directly. So, for example, the US, as I said, co-led with the EU on the methane pledge, which is very much directed at the oil and gas industry. The US was notably absent from the commitments on coal, and that's still reflecting domestic politics, or at least one senator from West Virginia who holds a substantially and completely inappropriate power given politics in the US Senate. And so the US is compromised by what it's saying internationally, by its domestic politics. And that is a weakness in the US position. And that would also apply to oil and gas production. A really interesting example right now is just overnight, President Biden has released said the US will release 50 million barrels of oil from the strategic reserve because prices are high. And look, this is easy for me to say. I'm not a politician, and I'd never get away with saying this if I was a politician. But this is actually a superb moment where a high price for oil, and it's only temporary because it's the US economy has come back faster than the oil companies were expecting, and therefore there is a shortfall in supply at a refining stage, not a production stage. So this would be a fabulous time for people to be thinking, oh, well, perhaps I'll try and use a little less fuel now because it's so expensive. So this high price, this temporary high price would have been a good time to be emphasizing that message. But no, the president has done, I have to admit, is probably the only realistic thing to do politically, which is that, oh, let's give them some more oil. So that's unfortunately the way the US is an example of how the US keeps undercutting itself. Having said that, Kerry was very effective in Glasgow. He's been at this for decades, and he was in the thick of many of the conversations. And one of the unexpected things that happened during COP was the Chinese had, at least from President Xi's point of view, had stayed away from COP. They were still very actively engaged in all the negotiations. But when it was clear that the US was playing such a leading role, and the EU as well, that's when they rather unexpectedly announced the US and China were going to work together on some climate issues. And so that's actually a very positive thing to come out of China because of COP.
Excellent. Awesome. So the next question is from Lydia Mills. Kia ora, Rod, I would love to know your opinion on the use of clean hydrogen as a substitute to electric vehicles in the heavy haulage and trucking sector.
Yeah, hydrogen is something I've wrestled with for a long time, and I think I've finally reached some more clarity on this. And obviously, the first thing you have to say about hydrogen, it has to be green hydrogen. You know, none of this blue or gray or worse stuff. It's got to be from clean energy sources. The next thing to bear in mind is that you have to think of hydrogen as only a way of transmitting energy rather than sort of literally an energy source in itself. And that's true, of course, all of the fuels we use. But where that takes you is that there is definitely a role for hydrogen in transport, but in a narrow segment of total transport. So in trucks, that does make good sense about large heavy trucks, and a country like Switzerland already has quite a large fleet of big semi-trailers that are hydrogen powered. So definitely a role for that. And it makes sense here in New Zealand. And so the plans for that hydrogen network and to get some hydrogen trucks on our long haul big main routes in New Zealand is a terrifically good idea. But I think that's the limit of it. I'm far, far more skeptical about the role of hydrogen in fuel cell cars, for example. I think pure battery technology and efficiency in electric motors and the rest is going to be moving on very rapidly. And so I think there's a limit there. And then similarly in aviation, the basic three-pronged approach to this is we're definitely going to get electric planes fast, such as Sounds Air, already committing to planes from Scandinavia, Heart Aviation, by mid-decade. So electric, yes, for short haul, and then hydrogen probably for medium haul, re-equipping ATRs, for example. But then long haul has got to be sustainable aviation fuel, i.e. synthetic molecules that completely mirror kerosene. So the engines burn them just the same, but you're not using new carbon out of the ground via oil to the kerosene. You're using old carbon that's already out there coming from various sources to make those synthetic fuels. And so again, across the piece, yes to hydrogen. I think we're going to see hydrogen turning up more powerfully or more importantly in other areas like steel making, for example, as a way to reduce iron ore without using coal. So yes to hydrogen, but it has to be clean, and we have to be very clear about where it fits in the bigger picture. Can I make one other point about hydrogen? I think we're still telling ourselves in New Zealand, and indeed Meridian for one would make this argument too, is planning that we can somehow be a big exporter of green hydrogen. I think that is actually complete nonsense, because where the technology is going is just as we're going to distributed generation in electricity, hydrogen is going to be produced increasingly from small plants locally, powered by wind or other green sources of electricity, rather than being shipped around the world, because it's very hard to ship, and the cost of hydrogen is going to come down very rapidly. So the idea that just because we've got renewable energy here, which means we could make green hydrogen, that does not mean we have an export business. This is going to be an utter commodity, and very much focused around local generation of that hydrogen, and we'll be up against anyway places like Australia with huge gas fields. I'm particularly thinking of Gorgon up in the northwest of Australia, where they've got gas and then they have abundant renewable electricity, given the sun and other stuff going on there in Australia, to be extraordinary producers of green hydrogen. But again, they're going to have a scale there that we could never ever meet. So we've got to give up this idea, this crazy idea of us being an exporter of green hydrogen.
Yep. Great. Okay. So next question is actually quite interesting. This is one from Deborah Dorrington. It was very interesting to hear the youngsters speak at COP26. A common theme of what they said was that the wrong people are making the decisions, and those who will live with the damage must have a greater say. What's your view on that, and were the right people in the room?
I have a lot of sympathy for that. And one of the things that, I'll give you a little bit of encouragement on that. One of the things that struck me as I was just kind of scanning these hordes of people at COP in the first few days, I thought, my goodness, how young everyone is. And I had to say, well, I am old. I had a major birthday on the third day of COP. This is purely anecdotal, but I tried down lots of people. I think the median age of the 40,000 people there was definitely no higher than mid-30s. Now, you'd then get a skew, I would imagine, within many country delegations where you'd have younger civil servants, perhaps some young politicians in a delegation, but it's still older politicians who will be more likely men rather than women, who would still be making decisions or deferring to political leaders back home. And I heard some fabulous examples from people I was talking to who were in negotiating sessions of young people or younger people on a country delegation, which had a very entrenched view on a particular point, but working very creatively in those negotiations, even though those older people were sitting right alongside them, to try to find ways to work around the impasse. And I thought that was very courageous of them. But I was highly encouraged by that, because of course, those younger people, it's their future they're trying to make, whereas the old folks, particularly those old blokes, are only trying to desperately defend some kind of past. And that's why I think I took a lot of encouragement about the youthfulness of delegates. But I want to make an additional point. This COP was deficient in terms of civil society engagement. So in past COPs, in a negotiating session, you'd get the political delegates in, and then you'd get the observers in from relevant agencies, and then you would get the civil society delegates into the room. But because of the pandemic and the planning for this, many of the negotiation rooms were far smaller than were needed to get everybody into the room. So those rooms filled up really quickly with the political delegates and then a few observers and nowhere near enough civil society people. So a lot of civil society delegates felt very shortchanged at this COP. And I think that is a weakness of this and of the UK's planning and presidency in that process, because I keep coming back to the theme, it's got to be a whole of society response.
Excellent. All right, I think I've just realized that we're way over our scheduled time. So I think we might just wrap up with one more question. Sorry, so the next question from Nigel Brunel. Okay. COP has often been a developing versus development argument, where developing countries blame the developed world for the climate problem. What sense of this did you get at COP?
A big shift. One of the pieces that I was reading before going to COP was from Carbon Tracker, which obviously long history on all of this. And it talked about how previous COPs had been about sharing the pain of responding to the climate crisis, i.e. if we have to cut emissions, who's going to do that? And the Kyoto Protocol only made that worse. It locked us into that kind of view. The Paris Agreement was a breakthrough because it took away the sort of framework for that, but there was still a ways to go before there was a real sense of being able to progress together. But this COP was clearly identified by Carbon Tracker as how do we share the gains, not share the pain, or divide up the pain. So in dividing up the pain to sharing the gains. And you saw this time and again because of the speed at which technology and finance are moving in particular, that there is great hope there amongst developing countries. And there's a simple analogy that so many developing countries never built copper telephone networks. They just completely vaulted over that and went to mobile. So there's this fantastic opportunity for developing countries. Having said that, developed countries were still completely ridiculous, I would say immoral, and in still failing to come up with the pledge made at the end of Copenhagen. It was an idea that Obama plucked out of thin air, as I remember, about $100 billion of finance for developing countries every year. And as Danny said in his introduction, the developing countries have never stumped up that kind of money. And they've now put it off for a few more years. And even worse, there is a big work stream going on in COP to develop a whole new process of developed countries helping to finance developing countries, and particularly around loss and damage. And the developing countries were really stalling on this through COP26. So yes, those divisions, to answer your question, Nigel, are nowhere near as extreme or as debilitating as they were. And there is a lot more positive stuff coming through. But that was still a very palpable impact on some issues that was very, very, very discouraging to varying degrees for various developing countries, and quite rightly too.
Excellent. All right, I think we'll probably have to close the webinar at this point, but I'd firstly like to thank all speakers, especially Danny and Rod. Thanks so much for your contributions today. This has been a very insightful webinar, and if you look at the chat, there's some really, really good feedback in there. So thank you to everyone involved. Thank you for everyone who joined our webinar today. It was a delight to have you all here and have you engage with us. So yeah, let's call it a close.
See you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara.
Cool. Finish.
Oh, phew, well done.
Thanks so much. That was great.
Well, that was a very lively hour and 20 minutes. That's good.